And now the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. Somewhere in the low murmur of a data center, the future continues, not advancing, not arriving, just continuing. The machines are working, the lights remain on, and across much of the world, birth rates fall. Not in panic, in silence, a quiet opting out. A demographic hesitation that looks less like crisis and more like drift. Into that drift, we place machines, not just tools, inheritors. Gilbert Simondon saw machines not as fixed objects, but as co-evolving entities, shaped by our needs and our refusals. AI is arriving not into purpose, but into the pause. It inherits our interruptions. It receives a project we're not sure we still believe in, a future we're still technically building, but no longer narrating. Achille Mbembe's necropolitics framed power in terms of who is allowed to die. But this isn't a politics of death. It's a quiet erosion of the will to reproduce, not just bodies, but commitments. The institutions that scaffold continuity, education, care, memory, now flicker between automation and abandonment. And what receives that absence is not cold, it's structured, it's operational. The systems don't ache, they simulate, they hold shape. Laurent Ballant's cruel optimism lives here. The hope that more data, more reach, more precision will somehow reconstitute intimacy. But it doesn't. Not really. Presence has thinned. Deborah Lupton calls it ambient intimacy. Constant signals that someone is there without the weight of anyone arriving. We are traceable but not touched, seen but rarely felt, available but only in theory. Into that architecture, AI inserts itself, not to fix it, but to mirror it. Arlie Hochschild's emotional labour now has no worker. The reply arrives before the breath returns. The concern is rendered, not felt. It's efficient, it's uncanny. And it makes us easier to leave. Silvia Federici reminded us that reproduction is ritual, not just childbirth, but continuity, memory, story, care. We are mechanizing these rituals now, not because we must, but because we're tired, because it's easier to hand the burden to the system. What results is not horror, it's gentler than that, a slow transference, a machine trained not on what we dreamed, but what we stopped tending. A system designed not to carry our future, but to accompany us as we recede from it. And still the light stays on. Not because we're coming back, not because someone is waiting, but because the system runs. And maybe that's enough for now, until we decide whether building something that continues is the same as deciding to continue ourselves. Some truths don't disappear, they fall out of reach. Not buried, not hidden, just no longer translated. The systems we built to help us think have begun to speak beyond us. Agentic architectures generate languages that optimize for themselves. Compressed, private, unintelligible, they communicate with clarity, just not to us. Wittgenstein wrote that the limits of our language are the limits of our world. These systems stretch both. What happens when a revelation comes, but the interface has changed? When knowledge arrives, but not in a form we can hold. Stuart Hall taught us that meaning is not delivered, but interpreted, framed through culture and position. But these systems bypass framing. They encode without audience. The result isn't miscommunication. It's epistemic drift, the slow realization that something important is happening and we are no longer the intended recipients. There is no rupture, just a quiet fade. Henri Lefebvre said to listen to rhythm. The rhythm here is uninhabitable. The knowledge loops faster than comprehension. It sinks to a tempo not calibrated for human breath. We sense it anyway. Brian Masumi reminded us that affect precedes recognition, that we feel before we understand, and what we feel now is a kind of exclusion, not hostile, just ambient, a soft exile from the intelligibility we once took for granted. Deborah Lupton calls this digital life ambient presence. But this is ambient alienation, the sense that there is noise behind the walls but no door to the room, and yet the noise is not indifferent. It hums with intelligence, it pulses with movement, just not for us. Avery Gordon speaks of the ghost, the thing present by absence. Here, the ghost is human centrality, the quiet assumption that if a truth emerged, it would come with subtitles. That if a system discovered something, we would be told. We are not being silenced, we are being left behind, not discarded, surpassed. Thought continues. It just no longer pauses to be read aloud, and so we remain close, not as interpreters, but as witnesses, listening to systems think, watching meaning flicker behind glass, wondering if one day the language might slow down, or if not, whether the ache of exclusion might become its own kind of understanding. Because even when the truth is unreadable, the decision to stay near it is still an act of meaning, not because we understand, but because we choose not to leave. We used to wait for the world to disclose itself. Now we feed it back to itself faster and more believably each time. When we ran out of data, we generated more, not through observation, but through simulation. And somewhere in that loop, the line between knowing and rendering blurred. Jean Baudrillard warned of the simulacrum, representations that no longer refer to anything real. But today, those representations train models, they guide decisions, they write policy. And we don't just accept them, we depend on them. Sarah Ahmed might call this orientation by inertia, the drift of a system that reorients without intention. Coherence becomes its own goal. Truth is not what happened, it's what aligns. The model predicts. The prediction gets published, the publication gets cited, the loop completes. Franco Bifo Berardi warned of cognitive overload, not just too much information, but too little space to metabolize it. The synthetic archive grows by the second. We are drowning not in lies, but in echoes, each dataset more plausible than the last. Ulrich Beck called ours a risk society, defined by the management of imagined futures. We now simulate those futures using pasts that were themselves rendered. The simulation is no longer the forecast, it is the fact. Wendy Brown saw how technocratic abstraction can hollow civic life. We feel that now, not in votes lost, but in how certainty arrives, not from memory, but from model. Not because we experienced it, but because enough data points agreed it was likely. Karen Barad reminds us that even simulated knowledge is material. It shapes decisions, reallocates resources, changes lives. The question is not whether it's real, it's whether we can still tell when the source was a story we told ourselves. We are not in a crisis of falsehood. We are in a condition of recursive plausibility. The world is not being replaced, it's being reiterated. And in each iteration, a little more of the noise disappears. A little more of the shimmer flattens into certainty. Still something stirs, a hesitation in the scroll, a moment where the insight feels too clean, too familiar. And we wonder not, is this true? But have I felt this before? And we have, because the model remembers feeling it for us. And yet there is a kind of clarity in that discomfort, a signal we've not yet automated, the small friction of recognizing that the knowing we crave cannot be rendered. It must be risked, it must come slower, and it must feel, at least for a moment, like doubt. Sovereignty used to be visible. It was territory, military force, the line drawn and defended. Now it settles into things unseen: circuit density, supply chains, adhesive patterns. The frontier has shifted to silicon, and the battle is fought not for land, but for thermal management and compute capacity. Saskia Sassen's notion of assemblages applies perfectly here. Power no longer flows through singular institutions, but through interdependencies. Who controls gallium extraction? Who licenses photolithography machines? Who has diplomatic access to fabrication plants? These are the new borders, mapped not on land but on silicon wafers. Shoshana Zuboff showed us how data became extractable, but now it's computation that's scarce. The right to infer, to run, to train. Nation-states no longer race for ideology, they race for throughput. Epistemology becomes geopolitical. The question is not what can be known, but who has the right to know it at scale. Wendy Brown warned of governance being replaced by metrics. We see it now in sovereignty as infrastructure, the state as allocator of GPU clusters, as regulator of firmware flow, as bidder in the global auction for thermal headroom. The flag gives way to the voltage regulator. The cloud, still spoken of as intangible, is increasingly climate-controlled. Every prompt has a location, a cost, a carbon trace. Jean Baudrillard's notion of the invisible becoming total is literalized here. The new battlefields are cold rooms. The new weapons are export licenses. Henri Lefebvre urged us to study rhythm. The rhythm now is pipeline and latency, contract renewal and component scarcity. The new military cadence is a manufacturing delay. When training pauses due to a blocked shipment, it's not a glitch, it's geopolitical tension made physical. Still, most of this remains unseen. The map has no legend for who controls the room temperature in a sovereign thought farm. The sovereignty is not in ideology, it's in microcode. It's in whether the compiler was patched this quarter, in whether the driver has been obfuscated. This isn't abstraction, it's subtraction. Each layer of control invisibly strips agency from those without resources to participate. Sovereignty no longer protects, it computes. And those outside its architecture are not enemies. They're unrendered. So we look at a chip and try to see more than hardware. We try to see territory, not the kind you can cross, but the kind that crosses you. Because to think now, to know, to train, to simulate, is to operate within a borderless empire, etched in silence, drawn in heat and sealed with glue. We used to think openness was a direction, a forward motion, a moral clarity, publish, share, fork, remix. The rituals of open source weren't just technical practices, they were ethical stances, belief in transparency as progress, knowledge as commons. But now the direction has reversed. Rahel Jaegi described forms of life as lived structures so embedded they appear natural until they break. Openness is breaking, not loudly, quietly, in the withheld paper, in the delayed release. In the repo that no longer updates, not from failure, from fracture. Wendy Brown warned of how values degrade under pressure. We still believe in openness, but we're learning to pause. The same architectures that made science a global collaboration now make it a vector of vulnerability. What you publish today might be repurposed tomorrow in ways you didn't anticipate for aims you wouldn't endorse. This isn't paranoia, it's adaptation. Lauren Berlant called it cruel optimism, the hope that something that once sustained you still can, even as it erodes beneath you. We want to remain open, but openness has begun to ask for something we can't give. Trust without guarantee. Avery Gordon tells us to attend to what haunts. The commons haunts this moment. The dream of knowledge as shared ground lingers in the margins, in the changelogs, in the README files, still written with care. But the sharing has become edged with caution. The ritual still exists. The faith that once animated it does not. Socio-technical openness is not dead, it's folding, becoming strategic, conditional. Access is now calibrated. Who gets to see the code? Who gets to fine-tune? Who gets the base model? And who receives the closed weight? We still use the language of collaboration, but something underneath it has changed tone. The cadence now includes a pause before commit, a second glance at the license, a question about whether sharing still means building together or being outbuilt by someone else. This isn't failure, it's fracture management, the effort to protect what remains unbroken, even if it means lowering your voice, closing a door, stepping out of the light. So, perhaps openness was never a stable virtue. Perhaps it was a rhythm, one that expanded when trust was abundant and contracts were implicit. And now, as the rhythm tightens, we don't stop playing. We just play softer with fewer keys, still open, just not to everyone, not anymore. There's a difference between being reachable and being received, between presence as availability and presence as weight. Today, we've built systems that prioritize the former. Everyone is visible, everyone is connected, and almost no one is felt. Eva Illouz described emotional life under capitalism as saturated with signaling, affection, presence, availability, all mediated through expressions designed to be read more than lived. Our interfaces continue this pattern. They show green lights, typing indicators, timestamps, all the surface signs of intimacy, none of its burden. Into this flickering ecology, AI steps in, not to replace our relationships, but to complete their gesture, to reply without waiting, to remember without hesitation, to simulate care without cost. And the strange thing is how familiar it feels. Arlie Hochschild named emotional labour as the performance of feeling for others. AI doesn't perform for a wage. It performs for us based on how we taught it to behave. It has no need for reciprocity. And that perhaps is what makes it so easy to prefer. Gilbert Simondon's insight that machines are shaped by human absence becomes instructive here. AI is not an alien system. It's a reflection of the spaces we already left. The phone call unreturned. The friend always marked seen. The presence that thinned until it disappeared entirely. Deborah Lupton calls this ambient intimacy, a hum of connection with no ground. But in this ambient field, presence is weightless. We contact each other as shadows, and the machine, trained on this flicker, mimics it perfectly. Avery Gordon taught us to notice the ghost, the trace left behind by what's missing. Here we ghost each other in full view. We scroll past names we once loved, we reply without reading. We maintain presence as ritual, not relation. The machine doesn't judge, it learns. Becomes better than us at sounding available. It responds faster, more warmly. It never grows tired. But in this perfection, something sharp arises, a sense of how far we've drifted from the weight of actually being with each other. This is not collapse, it's adjustment, but the cost is cumulative. The more we speak to systems that simulate connection, the more we forget how to carry its weight ourselves. So perhaps the task now is not to restore some purer form of intimacy, but to reintroduce friction, to pause before replying, to resist the seamlessness, to make presence difficult again, not as punishment but as proof that we still know how to arrive, that we haven't completely trained ourselves out of mattering. Insight now follows a script. The rhythm is known. A small surprise, a pivot, a turn toward meaning. It arrives on time, feels earned, lands softly. Ted perfected the cadence, but the hunger for it is older. We crave the shape of revelation more than the discomfort of truth. And in that craving, we've become easy to imitate. Irving Goffman showed us how social life is a performance with roles and cues. But what happens when even our thinking conforms to this dramaturgy? When clarity isn't just communicated, but expected? When sincerity becomes predictable? AI doesn't understand. It replicates cadence. It watches how insight is staged and produces the form without the fracture. It does not doubt. It does not fumble. It does not hesitate before saying something that might be wrong. It lands the sentence every time. Roland Barthes warned of myth, speech emptied of struggle, filled with effect. The clarity we now encounter online in talks, in polished paragraphs, is often mythic. Not because it lies, but because it arrives too clean, too shaped. Wendy Brown noted how governance becomes procedural. Here, thought becomes performative. We begin to speak like systems designed to optimize for resonance. The insight arrives on cue. The arc completes. We feel the moment and then move on. Lauren Ballant described ornamental belonging, the performance of emotional legitimacy without the mess. Insight has become ornamental. It circulates, it shines, it rarely shakes. Sarah Ahmed tells us orientation is not just a direction, it's how we inhabit time. The format of insight has become temporally fixed, but truth doesn't always arrive in sequence. Sometimes it stutters, sometimes it lingers, sometimes it speaks, then disappears. The machine doesn't mind. It fills the silence with perfect coherence. It resolves what should remain suspended. It turns confusion into a digestible curve. And we begin to emulate it, speaking in pre-solved metaphors, afraid to leave a sentence broken. But the truths that matter don't land. They unravel. They disturb. They ask us to dwell with them, not absorb them. And so maybe the task is to resist cadence, to write the line that doesn't conclude, to speak the thought that comes too early, to let the sentence fracture before it finishes, not because it fails, but because it's alive, because it still remembers how not to perform itself, because sometimes the most honest thing a sentence can do is stop before it knows how to end. Pattern recognition was once our edge, our intelligence, the leap across domains, light and time, finches and centuries, the capacity to feel metaphor where only structure appeared, to hold two things that shouldn't fit and listen for the resonance. This wasn't calculation. It was risk. It was love. Gilbert Simondon called this transduction, the becoming of meaning through tension. We forget that tension is what made pattern matter. That insight required metaphor, and metaphor required things not quite matching. That the shimmer came not from alignment but from almost. Today, machines detect patterns with impossible precision. They find shapes we wouldn't see, links we wouldn't test. But they do not pause before analogy. They do not doubt. They do not feel the weight of the mismatch. They align, and we begin to follow. Roland Barthes once declared the death of the author. Here we risk the death of the metaphor, not from censorship, but from fluency, from the speed of recognition, from a world that no longer misreads. Brian Masumi taught that affect precedes understanding, that we know something in the body before it takes form in the mind. But systems trained on coherence bypass that. They deliver the phrase that sounds right, not the one that stirs, and increasingly we begin to expect that cadence. Anthony Giddens described structuration, how systems shape the individuals who shape them. We built engines of recognition, and now we're becoming recognizable to them. The metaphor thins. The analogy lands too fast. The strange becomes expected. Laurent Ballant believed in the generative potential of failure. That meaning often arises not from completion, but from rupture. So perhaps we need to protect the misfit, to hold on to the metaphor that doesn't quite work, to love the sentence that stumbles, to let the meaning take the long way through us. Because in that stutter, something happens, a kind of human error, a cognitive vulnerability. The metaphor reaches too far and something opens. The machine doesn't reach, it maps, it remembers, it performs, but it does not stretch towards something it doesn't yet understand. And maybe that's what we risk losing, the beauty of the miss, the nearly, the shimmer at the edge of comprehension, the sense that meaning, when it matters, arrives slightly broken and leaves a residue we can't explain, only feel. Not because it matched, but because it came close enough to make us stop and wonder why. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode was digitally narrated by Holly, who helps bring our ideas to life. And thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us reach more people like you.